message. As many of you are aware, I spent several weeks this summer in the Chautauqua Institution. That's a location where we discuss intellectual topics, spiritual topics, and it's a very peaceful place for reflection and rest. In fact, my co-op co-owner wants to call our new apartment our sanctuary because both of us feel so calm and rested there. Chautauqua Institution presents 9 weeks of programming each summer, and each week has a different theme. The themes guide the choice of speakers for the morning lectures, the afternoon book reviews and author talks, the small group discussions, and the spiritual speakers. There is a Unitarian Universalist denominational house where I spent quite a bit of my time. UUs can stay there, and it hosts a minister each week. In fact, last week's speaker, Rev. Amy, spent one of the weeks there in the UU house and presenting the service at the UU service. One theme that attracted me this year was what we got wrong, learning from our mistakes. Today I want to share some of the information I gained about one of those mistakes and how that mistake is threatening the water that we have on our earth for drinking, bathing, recreation, and fishing. I'm going to talk specifically about alga blooms. This summer I saw an alga bloom that led to the closing of the lake beaches in Chautauqua. And there was an order out to keep all your children and pets away from the water's edge. They couldn't swim, and there were no water-based recreational activities for more than a week. This bloom was timely since the weekly theme was our mistakes. And author Dan Egan was visiting the campus and discussing his most recent book, The Devil's Element. Dan Egan also wrote books about the Great Lakes. The one I read was The Life and the Death of the Great Lakes. It was published several years ago, and I found it most interesting. His new book, The Devil's Element, is about phosphorus, a necessary element for life on Earth. It appears in our food, both the plant and animal-based food, and in the DNA of all living things. Phosphorus is found in our excrements and in our remains. It turns out that the world's supply of phosphorus is dwindling. It was mined in former seabeds on bird-inhabited elements in the Pacific known as guana islands, and it's especially being mined in the United States today in Central Florida. These locations are estimated to provide phosphorus for less than 50 years. Phosphorus is being used liberally in the manufacture of fertilizer, something that has been vital to the increased crop yields that are required to feed our ever-expanding populations in the world. But that story is for another time. Today, the topic is water. So today we'll focus on that. The story begins with soap, something we all use, hopefully. Something that was made in the past in homes from animal fats and lye. Then came the Civil War, and the demand for soap increased. A company named Procter & Gamble started to manufacture soap in large quantities to meet that demand. They made the first soap bar, and later they made a very unique product called Ivory. What was unique about Ivory? Do you remember? Besides the fact it was 99.9% pure, it floated. And the way they made it float was by inserting air bubbles into the manufacturing process. In the early 1930s, When automatic washing machines came into use, soap was changed to a synthetic product labeled as detergent. When clothes weren't clean enough, Procter & Gamble chemists began to test a variety of additives to their detergent, and phosphorus was just the ticket. With the addition of phosphorus, the clothes were cleaner, but guess what? They were also stiffer because of hard water and phosphorus interactions. One chemist tried adding even more phosphorus, and that made the clothes not only clean, but softer. It also increased bubbles, and people liked bubbles because they felt that was cleansing. People were happy with this new product. Procter & Gamble shareholders were very happy because they prospered. Then the waterways and our lakes started to become dead. What do I mean by dead? Well, fishing became impossible because these dead zones didn't allow fish to live. Pollution of our waterways came into the news stories. Waterways, particularly in northern Indiana, or northern Ohio, especially Lake Erie, were among the first to gain notoriety about this problem. Since I grew up on the shores of Lake Erie on the east side of Cleveland in the 1950s and 60s, the cleanliness of our water, or lack thereof, was often in our news. Comments were made about the Cuyahoga River catching fire and Lake Erie having large dead zones where fishing couldn't exist. And I remember the beaches. The beaches had dead fish on them every morning. I would go down to the lake to swim, and there would be piles of dead fish on the shore. Fishing became hopeless, and soon Lake Erie would be good only for shipping and little else if nothing could be done. Canadian government, which also borders on the Great Lakes, started to do some significant experiments in some of their smaller lakes around the country. And the dead zones were found to be related to alga blooms. What do I mean? Well, the visible alga blooms were seen on the surface of these lakes from time to time. And phosphorus was determined to be the key promoter of these alga blooms because it promoted the small growth or the overgrowth of small photosynthetic organisms that depleted the water of the oxygen, and thus the fish wouldn't live there or they died. Eventually, the phosphorus content in detergent was regulated, at first by some states, and interestingly enough, Indiana was the first state to outlaw the use of phosphorus in the detergents and soaps. We are first in some things. Newer, less sudsing detergents were formulated, and in addition, sewage systems, which carried our excrements, were upgraded at great expense to municipalities, and the alga blooms started to disappear for a while. In 1972, the Clean Water Act was passed, and waterways were cleaned up. However, there was a major omission in that act, and that is the mistake that we talked about at Chautauqua. Agriculture was not among the targeted industries that could be regulated in terms of the use of phosphorus and the pollution of our waterways. Both manufactured fertilizer and manure contained large amounts of phosphorus. As our population has exploded, so has the need for higher crop yields and the rise of CAFOs, concentrated feeding operations. And those are the manufacturing level of putting animals in small areas, and they create large amounts of manure. Re-enter the frequency of alga blooms in the U.S. and around the world. Not only did Chautauqua Lake have a bloom this summer, but I understand that Potato Creek also has these blooms. At first, the alga blooms were a nuisance to recreational activities, but as times wore on, these blooms turned poisonous and dangerous to humans and beasts. Instead of just plain mixed algae, the blooms became associated with what is known as blue-green algae, or photosynthetic cyanobacteria, creating a bluish tinge to the bloom. That change happened in the Great Lakes when it became invaded with the zebra and quagga mussels. Smaller lakes became infested by the boats that were taken back and forth between the Great Lakes and the smaller lakes. And it turns out that the filtering capabilities of these invasive mussels, they're bottom feeders, and they can eat all of the algae, but they cannot eat, or they don't eat, the blue-green algae. They live at the bottom of the water, and they deplete the water of oxygen and fish kills. Besides using up the oxygen in the water, the cyanobacteria produces a toxin that destroys liver, and it causes the death to pets, livestock, wildlife, and it makes humans very sick, and sometimes it is deadly. That is why animals and humans are advised to stay away from waterways experiencing a blue-green algae bloom. Now, climate change affects these blooms in several ways due to water warming and air warming. The blooms are occurring earlier in the seasons and are more frequent. Due to heavier rains on dry soil, as well as no-till farming, any fertilizer placed on the fields will run off more easily. And due to increased demands for non-food uses, like ethanol production, corn and some other crops is using higher amounts of fertilizer. Now, I want to leave you with several questions, and these can be discussed amongst yourselves or just to think about. We live in the watershed of the Great Lakes. Some of our major cities on these Great Lakes draw their drinking water from the lake and the freshwater tributaries to the lake. What will happen in the future as toxic alga blooms occur more frequently on the Great Lakes? Already, the city of Toledo, you might remember a few years ago, in 2014, couldn't use their drinking water for a number of days because of the toxins present. And these toxins are not something that you can boil away. These are toxins that, when you boil them, become more concentrated. Okay? We recreate in the lakes and their tributaries. Will our progeny be able to do that in the future if the alga blooms are there so often? And will our politicians and our governments be able to rein in the phosphorus and other pollutants in our water? What will happen to our economy locally and in our state if ethanol is no longer needed in such high demand? Will the corn still be in such high demand? And if climate change continues to warm our air and water, will we have more frequent and more widespread alga blooms? What can we be done to make them less toxic? And finally, what will we do if the supply of mineable phosphorus in the world reaches depletion levels? I understand that currently the highest supply of phosphorus that can be mined in the world exists in the West Sahara of Morocco, and that is controlled by one man, the King of Morocco. So when the phosphorus supply is gone in the United States, will we be able to produce as much fertilizer and grow as much crops as we hope? That ends the message for today. And now we will